Good afternoon. This is the second lecture of the 9th edition of O.P. Jindal Distinguished Lectures. I am Ashutosh Varshney, Director of the Center for Contemporary South Asia here at Watson, and also a professor in political science. These lectures were endowed by Sajjan and Sangeeta Jindal, Brown Parents 2012, in memory of O.P. Jindal, Sajjan's deceased father. The purpose of the endowment is to promote a discussion of the politics, economics, society, and culture of modern India here at Brown. These lectures are held once every semester, and our speaker this semester is Pratap Mehta. He is President and Chief Executive of the Center for Policy Research, CPR, in Delhi. He is a political scientist who's taught at Harvard, Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, and the New York University, NYU, School of Law. And his areas of research include political theory, constitutional law, society and politics of India, and international affairs. Pratap has served on many central government committees in his role as a public policy intellectual and advocate, including India's National Security Advisory Board and the Prime Minister's National Knowledge Commission. He's on the editorial boards of many academic journals, including the APSR, American Political Science Review, the Journal of Democracy, and has been, for quite a few years, a columnist for and consulting editor for the Indian Express, and among the most widely read columnists in India. He holds a bachelor's in philosophy, politics, and economics from Oxford, and a PhD in politics from Princeton. The title of these lectures is The Nietzschean Moment in India's Intellectual History. In the first lecture delivered on Monday, Pratap dealt with Muhammad Iqbal's engagement with Nietzsche. The themes that stood out were how the ideal of self-abnegation, so central to Sufi Islam, can only enfeeble the Muslim community, according to Iqbal. How an exemplar-based Islamic conduct, the exemplar being Prophet Muhammad, can restore strength to the Muslim community. What the relationship between the self and the collective should be, and how, while the idea of tolerance can be capaciously defined, according to Iqbal, there can be no compromise on the finality of Prophet Muhammad's prophecy. Hence, the Ahmadiyyas, who speak of a post-Muhammad messenger of God, should not be extended the arm of tolerance. If Iqbal was a Muslim philosopher, today Pratap turns his gaze towards a Hindu philosopher, Aurobindo Ghosh. While he'll probe the shadow of Nietzschean thought in Aurobindo's philosophy, let me give a brief biography of Aurobindo. I hope that's helpful. So determined was his father, Calcutta-based father, to give Aurobindo an English education that he was sent from Calcutta. Aurobindo, the child Aurobindo, was sent from Calcutta to England at 7 years of age. After high school and education at Cambridge University, he returned to India in 1893. Feeling denationalized or deracialized, quote unquote, he plunged headlong into Indian culture and politics. But after a brief stint in jail, not only did he leave active politics in 1910, but he left British India altogether and settled down in the French settlement of Pondicherry, just outside Chennai, outside Madras, where he founded an ashram, devoted himself to a spiritual life and writing for the next 40 years until his death. It's been a flourishing ashram. Many thousand people have had access to it and have benefited from being there. The format is as follows. Pratap will speak for 40 to 45 minutes. We'll then have two commentaries of 10 to 15 minutes each. I'll introduce the commentators later. Then we'll open up for a discussion from the floor. Our formal proceedings will end at 4, but we can continue the conversation informally over the reception we're holding for Pratap right outside at 4 o'clock. The title of today's lecture is Metaphysics of Avoidance, Self and History in Aurobindo. Pratap Bhanu Mehta.
Thank you, Ashu. So last week, I tried to sort of ask this question, or one way of putting the question. There were several questions we went over, but sort of what was the use to which Iqbal put Nietzsche? And I defined a constellation that I described as the Nietzschean Moment, which had a number of elements in it. One is the measure of social institutions being the kind of personality that they actually spawn. A Nietzschean reading of the history of metaphysics, not just Western metaphysics, but Iqbal's use of Nietzschean motifs in his readings of Islamic thought itself. And in a sense, the framing of the problematic of modernity in horizons that were very Nietzschean, taking in a sense the internal crisis of Western reason for granted, and so on and so forth. And today what I'll do is, in a sense, a similar exercise for Aurobindo. I mean, as I said last time, what I was just struck by was this fact that two of these extraordinary thinkers, you know, some would argue the best in the traditions that they represented, turning out to have this deep and surprising engagement with Nietzsche. And it's really about capturing that intellectual sort of moment, I mean, what it represented to them, and why it might be worth sort of thinking about. So in that sense, there is necessarily a narrowing of focus. I mean, we could have whole seminars on Iqbal and Aurobindo, and as the wonderful discussants last time pointed out in different ways, I think Brigu in terms of the historiography and the metaphysical themes, particularly of time and history in Iqbal, and Bernard in terms of, you know, who really invited us to look into the account of the self much more deeply than I had. One can actually go in those two directions as well, but my focus will be on this kind of somewhat limited question of what is Nietzsche doing as a character in Aurobindo's story? Let's put it this way. At first level, it seems to be a very surprising juxtaposition. And the way in which I'll do it is I will depart a little bit from the somewhat detailed textual reading that I send the commentators to just kind of set the big picture of where I see Aurobindo's project, which then sets the backdrop for his use of Nietzsche, and particularly his use of Nietzsche in the early part of his book, The Human Cycle, and the first 3 chapters, which is what, in a sense, I focus on, although there are other references to Nietzsche as well. So just to sort of point to something, again, very surprising, you might recall the quote I had used from Iqbal about Nietzsche last time, where, you know, Iqbal, in a sense, presents Nietzsche as somebody who had literally seen the possibilities of liberation only to misunderstand his own message and to be consistently misunderstood by others. And if only Nietzsche had encountered Iqbal, right, the sort of the circle of liberation would have been complete. So here's Aurobindo and Nietzsche. I mean, he writes about Nietzsche in different places, and it'll just give you a sense of him. The parallelism is actually striking. Nietzsche first cast it, the mystic of will worship, the troubled, profound, half-luminizing, Hellenizing Slav, with his strange clarities, violent half-ideas, his rare gleaming intuitions that come marked with the stamp of an absolute truth and the sovereignty of light. But Nietzsche was an apostle who never entirely understood his own message. His prophetic style was like that of Delphic oracles, which spoke constantly the word of truth, but it turned untruth in the mind of the hearer. Not always, indeed, for sometimes he rose beyond his personal temperament and individual mind, his European inheritance and environment, his revolt against the Christ idea, his war against current moral values, and spoke of the word as he heard it, and truth as he had seen it, bare, luminous, impersonal, and therefore flawless and imperishable. But for the most part, this message that had come to his inner hearing, vibrating out of a distant infinite, like a strain caught from the lyre of far-off gods, did get, in his effort to appropriate and make it nearer to him, mixed up with a somewhat turbulent surge of collateral ideas that drowned much of the pure original note. Right? I mean, it's a really astonishing, and you can see I mean, it's almost, Iqbal could have written these words, right? I mean, if you see. So what is Nietzsche doing as a character in Aurobindo's story, right? Now, just to begin with a kind of parenthetical remark, and I'll just kind of say this and get it out of the way, Aurobindo is hard reading. And I just kind of autobiographically describe my personal relationship with reading Aurobindo. There was a kind of youthful fascination with his writing early stages. It looked all very enchanting. There is a certain kind of beauty to his prose. And then you go through that phase of incredible disillusionment with the writing. In fact, you almost feel like that moment. You remember A.J. Ayer's sort of Language, Truth and Logic, where he has this kind of revulsion against Bradley's verbosity and metaphysics, what seems like that. And Aurobindo can induce that at some point. And then maybe as you grow older, perhaps less hermeneutically suspicious, you come back and begin to see things in his writing that you actually hadn't noticed. I do think the prose is actually quite incandescent in moments. I mean, he can be a gifted writer in really, unprecedented ways, including in his poetry, like Iqbal also, right, who writes Asrar-e Khudi. Much of what Aurobindo is about is, I think, in Savitri, frankly, not in his prose works. The second, I think, interpretive challenge in Aurobindo, as everybody knows quite well, is Aurobindo positions himself as this great reconciler, which is that in some senses there is almost this kind of Hegelian impulse that if there are any contradictions, they can be probably reconciled at some higher plane of articulation or some higher reality. And if you don't have the kind of omniscience that he does, it can actually be sometimes frustrating reading him in terms of whether he's actually avoided certain crucial questions and whether that reconciliation is in fact a cop-out or not. So I will just kind of state that because I think it is a reaction a lot of people have reading Aurobindo. Now, the first and most obvious, I think, parallel with Iqbal in what Aurobindo is doing is, as I showed last time, Iqbal very much labored under the shadow of what the relationship, in a sense, between philosophy and history was going to be. And in some senses, for Aurobindo, that shadow is even greater. Almost all modern Indian thinking, from the late 19th century onwards, perhaps under the label of colonialism, operates under the shadow of this charge, that the contemporary philosopher Peter Sloterdijk has called India as the planetary granary of spiritual narcissism, right? Which is that everybody in the society is in the business of saving their whole souls, while society itself goes to hell. I mean, that is the single biggest sort of problematic, right, of modern Indian thinking. And each Indian thinker has to acknowledge, again, a paradox that Max Weber had noted, that Indian thought and Indian thinking in its different forms had the space for the most intense intellectual radicalism you can imagine, right? But it's almost all intellectual radicalism that ends up reconciling in some ways or accommodating social orthodoxy, right? And that's the sense in which, again, another, if you want to articulate it in terms of relationships of power, this charge of spiritual narcissism, right, that plagues almost all modern Indian thinking. And of course, Aurobindo early in his career, right, most of his early writings are devoted to refuting this charge. You say India doesn't have a politics, India actually has a politics. You say India doesn't have theory of the state, it kind of does. We can talk about it. But fundamentally, this is, in a sense, one of the shadows that it labors under. And this burden, I think, imposes an extraordinary intellectual task on somebody like Aurobindo, who has to, in a sense, like Iqbal did with the history of Islamic metaphysics, reconceptualize the history of Indian thought in a very different way. And the key figure in his reconceptualization, the key figure, the key villain, just as the Sufi metaphysicians worked as the kind of key villain for Iqbal, was the figure of Shankar. Right? I mean, in fact, you can actually argue, I think there's an interesting cultural history to be written. Almost all modern Indian thinking is a philosophical revolt against Shankar in one way or the other. Right? The charge that Shankar was not just a metaphysician, but it's ironic that Shankar was actually accused of being a crypto-Buddhist, right? Not just in the time when he wrote, but particularly in the late 20th century. And in order to rescue Indian thinking from the ghost of Shankar, right, essentially you had to make 4 big moves. And I think one way of thinking about Aurobindo's project is in relation to those 4 big moves. I won't talk about all 4, I'll just talk about one of them, but I think it's worth remembering what they are. The first big move is reconceptualization the relationship between action and the world, right? Which is, as human agents, we act in the world, and what is the sense in which history actually takes up our actions. Now, this relatively straightforward idea or straightforward problematic is, of course, a pretty revolutionary idea in modern Indian thinking. It's a pretty revolutionary idea in the following sense. You know, Sibaji Bandyopadhyay has just written this absolutely magnificent book, 3 essays on the Mahabharata, and one argument he makes, I mean, it's just brilliantly done, is he reads almost all modern Indian intellectual thinking as a gloss on refuting Shankar's interpretation of Bhagavad Gita 247, right? Where Shankar, in his account of action, had basically argued that, you know, Bhagavad Gita 247, karmanyavadikaraste, right, the relationship between action and the world, had taken it in a contemplative direction, right? And this is an incredible social history of the interpretation of Gita 247 in the modern world, where in a sense, thinker after thinker, right, basically tries to actually deploy that particular shlok of the Bhagavad Gita to recontextualize, reconceptualize the relationship between action and history in a, you might say, activist or a non-contemplative direction, right? So the first problematic is this relationship between action and, action and history in some ways. The second problematic is, of course, Shankar's Mayavad, right? Which was the idea that, to put it very loosely and colloquially, the phenomenal world is a world of illusion. The world of particularity, variety, and differentiation is the world of Maya and illusion par excellence, right? And this is a world that actually will be transcended by, in a sense, the absolute. Now, it was important to refute this idea of illusionism because it actually goes with the first problematic, which is, if the world is in fact indeed an illusion, right, then action turns out to be illusion as well, in some respects, at least as traditionally conceived or as conceived in Shankar's metaphysics, and therefore the space opens up, right, for a direct, unmediated experience of something called the absolute, right, that negates all of this variety, differentiation, and particularity, right? And this is, again, a problematic we saw in Iqbal coming up in, right? The third issue, which, again, relates to, is in a sense on the experience of transcendence, right? And this is Aurobindo's big project, of course, in Savitri in Life Divine, which is to try and describe perhaps in phenomenological terms, what the experience of transcendence and divine mind might mean. Aurobindo describes Shankar's experience as a mind passing through the gates of transcendence without intermediate transitions, which receives a sense of the unreality of the world and the sole reality of silence, right? And Aurobindo argues, in a sense, that this is actually a spiritual experience of negation. This is not a spiritual experience that can actually affirm life in all its totality. It is an authentic spiritual experience, but it is an experience of the absolute via nihil, as it were, right? Via nothingness. And that's the sense in which, right? Again, the charge that Shankar is this crypto-Buddhist asceticism, life-denying, right, figure in Indian history. Right? The last and final problematic, and this is where Nietzsche figures in, this is the one I want to sort of focus on, is, so even if you, right, reconceptualize a theory of action, reconceptualize a theory of spiritual experience in some ways, right, and refute Shankar's Mayavad, right, the idea that the world of particularity is not an illusion in some ways, right? What do we do with human history, right, conceived as a succession of human creativity reflected in different social institutions across time, right? You might say the Hegelian problematic. How can the divine be reconciled, in a sense, with this evolution of human history? And that really is the problematic that sets the stage for Aurobindo's book, The Human Cycle, right? He's already cleared the way for it by basically reformulating Shankar by saying that whereas Shankar regards, right, the phenomenal world, the world of particularity, as a world of appearance, this is the world of Plato's mere shadows, as it were, right? Not the real world. There's an absolute reality to be apprehended, unmediated through these shadows. Aurobindo basically argues, or begins with the metaphysical starting point, that the world is not the world of shadows or appearances, it is actually the world of manifestation of the divine, right? And it's this contrast between whether you see the phenomenal world as a world of appearances or shadows, if you want to use that Platonic language, or whether you see in these different expressions of the world, nature and history, right, a form of divine manifestation. So that's the kind of metaphysics. And then you begin to ask the question, okay, if indeed the world is that form of divine manifestation, right, what kind of manifestation does the evolution of history actually represent, right? Now, of course, there's a Hegelian twist to this question, and sometimes Aurobindo was accused of being Hegelian, though I shall argue that what he does is actually very different, which was to see history as, in a sense, the march or the progressive realization of the absolute spirit, right, coming to full self-consciousness, right? Now, Aurobindo begins, I think, the human cycle with two interesting and fairly radical presumptions that I do think, as I'll demonstrate, will have a Nietzschean tinge to it. The first is, like Iqbal, he's also very concerned with the idea that human individuality not be effaced, that the human individual remains the site of the progressive self-manifestation of divine consciousness, and this individuality is not subsumed, right? It does not become a mere predicate of or a mere adjectival manifestation of the larger divine consciousness, right? And it is the individual, right, is the central node through which the spirit manifests itself. But the second move that he makes, which I think is equally interesting and novel, I think, in Indian thinking at the time, which is the evaluation of social institutions, right, by the kinds of psychological dispositions that they actually foster. And in fact, one of the methodological, I think, ambitions of the human cycle as a book is to, in a sense, sort of displace material and social explanations of historical development with what you might call social psychological explanations. In Aurobindo's words, there is the beginning of a perception these days, he says, and this is a good thing, that behind economic motives and causes of social and historical development, there are profound psychological, even soul factors, right? And what he tries to do in the early chapters, the first three chapters, which I'll focus on in the human cycle, is give an account of just what these soul factors are, right, that get manifested in particular historical institutions. But I think at this point just wish to underscore, I think, the radicalness of this claim, because in some senses, and one of the interesting things about the way Nietzsche is read in the Indian tradition is Nietzsche is the kind of anti-Marxist, right? It's a kind of odd thing to think about it, but Nietzsche is the kind of anti-Marxist in a one very specific sense, which is the idea that the soul, or whatever these life psychological forces are, they cannot be reduced to, or they cannot be fully accounted for purely by material determinations, right? I mean, this is actually, in a sense, and this is the big contest in modernity, right? Which is, I mean, if you're in the critical theory tradition, the skeptics, Adorno's, Horkheimers will actually argue that all of these appeals to a subjectivity that is not constituted in some ways, right, or formed by the material implications of the world, that itself, I mean, at best is a kind of form of bourgeois avoidance. And I think it's an interesting question to ask about figures like Aurobindo and Iqbal, whether fundamentally, right, this claim that there is a self that can actually exceed the boundaries of these material determinations, right, is not just a tenable one, but is something that can actually articulate convincingly. So what seems like a relatively innocuous exercise, psychological factors, soul factors, is actually quite a radical move if you think of it in relation to the rest of history. Now, what Aurobindo, as you know, famously does is, in a very brief section, he goes through a typology of human societies and the kinds of soul factors that lie behind them, or the psychological dispositions that in some senses underlie them. I will just be very brief and kind of synoptic about this kind of typology, and just so that we can get quickly to the point where does Nietzsche fit into, and why is this typology important to understanding the role of Nietzsche. Now, it is an interesting question what the role of this typology, where he says human history passes through successive stages. There's the symbolic age, there's a typal age, there's a conventional age, and finally the kind of modern age of subjectivism that is actually sort of dawning in. What's interesting is that the principle of organization of all of these stages is by the social psychological type of personality to which it gives rise to, right? And more importantly, right, this articulation of history passing through these successive stages begins to at least provide some materials for solving the problem that I posed in the fourth puzzle, which is how does one account for the meaning of history in a sense all of this, if Indian philosophy is to be rescued from this charge of this is just narcissism of the self run amok. So the first stage that he identifies, and I won't go into detail, we'll come back to it in discussion. I think Stephen has something to say about it, and not surprisingly as a kind of Bethai scholar, which he refers to in that context as referring to the Vedic age, is the symbolic age. And the symbolic age is in a sense characterized by basically the idea that almost all social structures are symbolic manifestations of the divine cosmos, right? Aurobindo is emphatic that you cannot understand the meaning of any of the rituals of the Vedic age, or even its social structure, with any of the modern hermeneutical techniques of interpretation that are available to us. Which is, this is such a fusion of self and symbol, as it were, right? That the self actualizes itself so thoroughly through symbolism, that our instrumental modes of interpreting them, right? In a sense, we can't even begin to understand actually what's going on. And what I find interesting about this characterization, I mean, we can talk about the details in the discussion, but I think the important point about this characterization, which Aurobindo is actually very emphatic about over and over again, something that's missed in Aurobindo exegesis, is he basically says the Vedic age is inaccessible to us, right? Although Aurobindo himself does write book Secret of the Vedas, right? But it's done against a self-consciousness that there is a unity of symbolization and cosmos, that might have in its ideal type represented in perfection, that we cannot even actually begin to comprehend the meaning of, right? And in that sense, if you actually read Aurobindo's Vedic interpretation, in fact, what's striking is the lens he goes to which to understand, to actually make this claim, that this is a form of symbolization that remains fundamentally inaccessible to us. There's no going back to the Vedas, right? Which is actually in its own way quite a subversive sort of political move. The second age, which is, is if the symbolic age is characterized by a kind of religiosity, right? I mean, I think the only analog I can think of who would have loved the symbolic age in the Western tradition is somebody like Eric Vogelin, right? Where the idea was that there is a symbolic articulation of the cosmos, and that symbolic articulation actually gets ruptured by the Gnostic revolution in Christianity. There's something like that parallel move happening in Aurobindo, where the symbolic age is then replaced by, right, basically what you might call the typal age, whose basic characteristic is the articulation of an ethical code, right? The symbolic age is characterized by an absence of justification, right? Nature is what it is, and you just symbolically articulate it. There is no psychological distance between the people who inhabit that society and the social institutions and symbolism they find themselves under. Again, this is a point we can actually discuss. But in this ethical age, this typal age, right, the symbolic articulation of the cosmos is replaced by some form of ethical code, right? But the important point about the introduction of an ethical code, right, is two things. One, of course, an ethical code is open to justification in the way in which a symbolic articulation is not. So it sets the mode, prepares the ground for a certain kind of questioning. But more importantly for Aurobindo's purposes, it is when society is seen as being governed by a set of ethical commandments that the first split begins to happen between our psychological needs and dispositions and the external reality of the social institutions we actually find ourselves under, right? As he says, in these social ideas, they cease to have a living root in the clear psychological idea or to spring naturally out of the inner life of man. They become a convention, though sometimes the most noble of conventions. In the end, they remain more as a tradition in thought and on the lips rather than the reality of life, right? So the gesturing of, as I said, the split between the objective reality of external institutions and the possibilities of life and inner life, which was not possible in the symbolic age, where, in a sense, both fit each other. That is the characteristic of the typal age, right? And the typal age, through a certain metamorphosis, which I won't go into, sort of transforms into the conventional age, which represents the full divorce of the inner psychological impetus and social position of individuals from their social institutions. As he says, in the conventional age, the outward expressions of the spirit of the ideal become more important than the ideal. The body or even the clothes become more important than the person, right? And just as an aside, Aurobindo has a kind of interesting and problematic discussion of caste in terms of in these categories, where basically in the Vedic age, caste works through the articulation of symbolization. In the typal and conventional age, it gets rigidified into a series of external injunctions, right, rather than personality types. And I think one has to say this at this point, that I think it's a very fair critique of Aurobindo to argue whether, whether this kind of articulation of the ideology of caste is not susceptible to what you might call an ideology critique of some kind, right? Which is when you're making the claim that there is no split or dissociation between the symbolic articulation of personality and the external social institutions in the symbolic age, whose vantage point is it, right? And I think that's an absolutely fair critique of Aurobindo, although he himself sort of gestures at the possibility of that critique, right? But the important thing, as I said, about this conventional age is that the external world begins to appear to us merely as a series of conventions, right? A series of conventions that stifle us, that interdict us, that in some senses abridge the possibilities of the self. There's a phrase from Lukács that I kind of use in this context sometimes. Lukács had this wonderful phrase about modern institutions being the charnel house of rotted interiorities, right? And that in some senses captures the flavor of Aurobindo's account of the conventional age. Now, the conventional age, I'm quickly going through this to sort of get to the Nietzschean point. The conventional age gives way to what Aurobindo then calls the age of individualism, right? When the petrification of, as it were, the conventional age becomes unbearable, right? The psychological split between the external institutions and individual self, right? Then you might say there is the consciousness of a certain kind of alienation from your own social reality, and a consciousness of alienation from truth. And this is the condition that then generates the seeds of revolt, right? And what's interesting about Aurobindo's account, he writes a history of this revolt as if this was a global history of that revolt. In Europe, it's characterized by Protestantism, right? And in sort of India, if you like, versions of the Bhakti movement in some senses, right? Both of which he sees as, in some senses, a revolt against the rigidities of a conventional age. The net result of this revolt, right, and it's a really wonderful passage in his book, which is, in a sense, the liberation of the reformer of the individualist age. The reformer of the individualist age is characterized, in a sense, by three conditions. One, a refusal to now acknowledge any authority. Second, raising the demand for verification or justification. And the third is a denial of the authority of law or any law other than your own. As he says, the reformer of the individualist age asks, but is it really so? How shall I know that this is the truth of things and not superstition and falsehood? When did God command it? Or how do I know that this was the sense of his command and not your error or invention? Or that the book on which you found yourself is his word at all? Or that he has ever spoken his will to mankind? The immemorial order of which you speak, is it really immemorial, really a law of nature, or an imperfect result of time, or at present, at most a false convention? And of all you say, still I must ask, does it agree with the facts of the world, with my sense of right, with my judgment, with my truth, and with my experience of reality, right? So in that sense, it's that moment of liberation. But here, in a sense, comes the Nietzschean twist, right? And the Nietzschean twist is the following, which is you often get the sense reading the human cycle that Aurobindo kind of goes out looking for a kind of Hegelian story of the progressive manifestation of the absolute in history, and ends up with something like the dialectic of enlightenment, right? And the Nietzschean twist is the following, which is that even though this individualist age, right, erodes authority, questions the authority of law, opens up the space for justification, right? Both in the scientific sense and in the moral sense. You can ask why, right? It actually contains the seed of a new form of oppression, right? It contains a seed for new form of oppression because reason, right, in the conventional age begins to perform a dual function. On the one hand, it's an instrument of questioning, right? It's an instrument that allows you to break down of authority. On the other hand, this very reason itself can become an instrument of social domination, right? In fact, Aurobindo argues much in the way that Nietzsche and perhaps Max Weber did, that a world that has the conceit of being based on a world of knowledge will also be a fully administered world, right? And this is the central paradox of the relationship between reason and freedom, elements of which you find in Nietzsche, that the very thing that liberates us, right, from the rigidities of the conventional age also ends up preparing the ground, right, for a new form of domination to emerge. For example, this age of reason will relapse into a subsequent determination of function by experts who shall know us better than ourselves and choose for us our work and our quality. So if you ever want kind of skepticism of modern social sciences conceit to be able to control and dominate individuals, Aurobindo is a good guide. So the paradox of this individualist age is that a new rigid social order is established, albeit a rationalistic order that negates individual freedom itself, right? And what ends up happening as a result is that what should have been a moment of liberation, right, begins to rapidly petrify into a system of rationalistic conventions itself, right? Okay. So that's the sense in which, again, I mean, it's a very Nietzschean reading of, you know, that particular moment. But the two achievements of this age of individualism that Aurobindo thinks will have to be, in a sense, taken along as history flows is, one is a democratic conception of right, even though Aurobindo argues, much like Iqbal did, that a democratic conception of right that instantiates itself simply as a formalistic, rigid system of rule of law can also become an instrument of domination. And the second, again, Nietzschean move is that the individual will remain the central, as it were, social unit of consciousness with its own distinct being, identity, and its own distinct truth, right? And in fact, one of the measures by which you actually judge domination, right, is by the social system's ability, right, to allow space for this individuality to flourish, right? So the revolt, again, so the Protestant revolution, as it were, needs another Protestant revolution on behalf of the self, right? Which can, in a sense, revolt against this new order of freedom and rationality. And this will be, in a sense, the coming of the subjective age, right? And it's amazing that in the human cycle, in his characterization of the subjective age, which is what is the intellectual ground that has prepared the way for the coming of this subjective age that can surpass this rationalist, administered order of freedom that the modern world bequeaths to us, that the figure of Nietzsche looms large. In fact, it's the only figure actually who Aurobindo quotes. I mean, Nietzsche is quoted 6 times in the human cycle, and Aurobindo says, there will be a transition from this rational and utilitarian world to a world of individuality and subjectivity. The change has been made possible by a rapid turning of a current of thought into large and profound movements, contradicting old intellectual standards, right? Which is swiftly breaking old tables. The materialism of the 19th century is giving way to a moral and profound vitalism, right, which has taken various forms from Nietzsche's theory of the will to power, right, at a root of law and life to a new pluralistic and pragmatic philosophy. And Nietzsche's philosophy in this sense is pluralistic because it concentrates on life over soul, individuality, as it were, over its subsumption, and it's pragmatic because it seeks force and action rather than light and knowledge and the control that actually comes out of light and knowledge. So this subjective age, and it's interesting that Aurobindo reads Nietzsche this way, right? I mean, I'm not sure Nietzsche in the history of European thought was quite read always that way. That what's important about Nietzsche's revolt against that conventional age, which he thinks will become a kind of world current, emblematic of the world current, is that it's a revolt against 19th century materialism because it preserves the possibility of individuality over and above its material determination. And you can imagine the kind of, this is a sort of very post-Marxist or at least a critique of Marxism and historical materialism in all its variants. And second, that it begins to move to a new form of knowledge that will not be susceptible, right, to the kind of capture by rational domination that the knowledge and liberation of the conventional age had bequeathed to us, right? Where, in a sense, the purpose of knowledge, right, was a kind of instrumental domination, even when that knowledge was, secured to, in a sense, liberate individuals, right? It ended up in a kind of form of self-domination. And so the rationalistic ideal will now begin to be subject itself to, quote, the ideal of intuitional knowledge and a deeper self-awareness. A utilitarian standard will give way to an aspiration towards self-consciousness and self-realization. The rule of living according to manifest laws of physical nature is replaced by an effort towards living according to the Whale law and will and power active in the life in this world and in the inner and outer life of humanity, right? And I think it is a matter of, great intellectual surprise and interest that Aurobindo, looking for a philosophy of history, sort of ends up at, almost the kind of perfect Nietzschean moment. In almost all its kind of manifestation, and Nietzsche as it were representing that current of thought, which promises a new kind of liberation. Now, what I want to end with just kind of quickly is, so you can now sort of see, I don't even have to spell out the parallelisms between what Iqbal does with Nietzsche and what sort of Aurobindo does with Nietzsche. I just want to end with 2 or 3 thoughts about what do we make of this project, right? At one level, sometimes, particularly discussions in India, when you think about projects of these kind, what Iqbal and Aurobindo were after, they are burdened by, 3 kinds of questions. The first is obviously the social question. I think you could say that post-independence, right, and maybe for good reasons, thinking about Islamic metaphysics in the way that Aurobindo or Iqbal had imagined, or thinking about this engagement with Shankar in the way in which Aurobindo had mentioned, becomes the object of suspicion because this thinking never took the social question seriously, right? And the dominance of that social question, the idea that every form of metaphysical speculation, right, must be subject to, right, the test of social justice, right, where in a sense, again, objectivity gets contained within solidarity, right, in a sense just brings all these projects to a kind of dead end. There are metaphysicians, there are Aurobindoites, there are Iqbal's disciples, but they're like little after shadows, kind of, like the incense perfume, incense smoke from Aurobindo ashram, right? Reminds you of something originary, but literally an after effect of a project that, while it held enormous promise, didn't go anywhere, right? And I think you can see that parallel problem as we saw, in Iqbal's thought, the social problem arising about the conceptualization of plurality, and in Aurobindo's case, around the conceptualization of caste. The second thing you argued, which Aurobindo himself was very conscious of, and Ashu did mention this, so I'll just say that I should say something about the politics, which is, of course, the kind of fissure in consciousness of the partition of India itself actually produced to the project of this idea that India could be the exemplar of a new form of ethical community, right? Where each individual, on the one hand, actually recognizes the interiority of their self, that the self is more than what it is, but somehow acquires the ability to will the same thing for other selves, right? So it, in a sense, reconciles India's traditional spiritual narcissism, right? So long as that spiritual narcissism is equally available to everybody else, right? The idea of a kind of perfect community or a community bound by a shared ethical project of seeking perfection, this higher self, could be actually realized. And you might say that, look, the sheer fact of partition itself, right, just undoes that metaphysical project. I mean, it's just even hard to begin to articulate the possibilities of that. For Iqbal, that partition, in some ways, or at least the creation of those two distinct communities, was a necessary vehicle for the realization of, as it were, you might call this new subjective age, right, where the individual as a locus of creativity and a self higher than the current self could actually cohabit with others in that same realization. Aurobindo's political position in this was the opposite of Iqbal's. And, if you read his last kind of poignant message at India's independence, the 5 dreams he has, he basically argues that so long as this partition remains, I mean, whatever, you think of it as, I think he is more the partition of mind rather than the territorial partition. The project of, right, in a sense, imagining a society that redeems the individual beyond the petrified conventions of the nation state is in a sense unlikely to be redeemed. And third and finally, and this is in a sense what I want to kind of end with, which is, Max Weber very recently said that in the modern world we're either all Marxists or Nietzscheans, right? I mean, these are the sort of, and is there a way in which you could actually argue that Indian metaphysical thinking is more or less run its course in 2 different forms in Aurobindo and Iqbal? It's run its course in one, not just in this political sense, which you might say is a contingent sense, but it's run its course in one very significant sense, which is that the fundamental ontological claim, right, that the project of history is to rescue this self that can be something more than the sum of material determinations, right? That this project has very little public credibility left, right? That subjectivism, right, which in their imagination was a new mode of public articulation and liberation, really does retreat into such kind of narcissistic interiority, right? That its connections with politics and history, which they were trying to, in a sense, reestablish, begin to look implausible. So what you get left in its wake, right, and this is something neither of them had imagined, a form of society in the nation state, right, which to both of them, in some ways, exemplified exactly the kind of abnegation of individuality, right, that they had warned against in the institutions of the conventional age on the one hand, right? And on the other hand, right, this sort of fall where there's a moment in that historical culture where everybody is talking about these highest ideals of perfection, right? And where do you fall from that? To the most instrumental form of reason, in a sense, run amok. And Aurobindo had warned of something like this. I mean, he had said, in fact, he was asked at some point, and he why do you think of this higher self and forms of perfection, and he had basically argued that if we don't aim at the highest, right, then the chances are that our descent, our fall, as it were, into the instrumental reason will be actually the sharpest and the deepest, that you needed that as an antidote to preserve ourselves from our basic instincts, our baser instincts. And in this sense, his response was, you might say, it was not a liberal response, which is because the liberal response has traditionally been, you lower the sights of perfectionism, right? So that in some senses that the fall you are capable of also becomes less deep and dangerous. And some would argue that the tragedy of modern India in some ways, right, is that here were two thinkers who aimed so high, right, that when we started falling, it was all free fall. Stop there.